The entire history of the American Revolution. To Fall Asleep. 2. Full documentary. The world did not know what was coming. The air was still. The oceans moved with their usual calm rhythm, rocking softly against the wooden ribs of ships that crossed from one shore to another. On distant farms, men rose with the sun. They moved slowly. They ate in silence. The sky above the American colonies was wide and pale. The trees breathed. Birds sang. But no one was listening for omens yet. In England, candles flickered in hallways of stone. Parlours were filled with books, coats, the slow rustle of paper. Gentlemen talked of trade, of law, of empire. They did not yet speak of blood. In the colonies, life was shaped by season and survival. Winter brought silence, summer brought toil. Roads turned to rivers of mud. Churches stood tall over small towns. Bells rang, echoing into the distance. Children learned their letters by firelight. Mothers made bread by hand. Everyone knew their place. And though the crown rested thousands of miles away, its weight could still be felt. In coins, in rules, in the quiet fear of doing something wrong. It was a strange peace, not free, not entirely broken, but full of cracks that no one wanted to see. People bowed to the king across the sea, but few had ever seen his face. And still, they were loyal. For now. In taverns, men shared rumours like smoke. Ships had been seen. Prices were rising. There was talk of new taxes, but no one truly believed change would come. Or if it did, that it would matter much. After all, life had gone on for years like this, and so it continued. Quiet. Predictable. Until it no longer could. We invite you now, with care and warmth, to lie back and listen. This story is for you. A gentle telling of hard times. We truly care for your peace tonight, and we thank you for letting this voice keep you company. Before we begin the story, tell us, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now grab your coffee, and let's get started. Life in the colonies moved to the rhythm of the land. The wind decided how far a journey would go. The harvest decided if a family would eat. There were no great clocks counting the hours, only the slow sun and the turning moon. In the north, villages clung to rocky coasts, stubborn and proud. People there were close-knit, hardened by cold. In the south, vast plantations stretched across the earth. Tobacco, rice, indigo, the work was endless, and much of it was not free. Enslaved people moved quietly under the watch of those who would never call them by name. Their hands shaped the wealth of men who spoke often of freedom. In cities like Boston, Philadelphia, and Charleston, voices grew louder. Merchants, printers, lawyers. Words moved faster than wagons. Ideas leapt from page to page. Pamphlets were pressed and passed around, full of careful thought and quiet fire. Many still believed in loyalty to the crown, but many more began to wonder. What was this land? Who truly ruled it? What did it mean to be free? No one had answers, not yet. But the questions lingered in rooms lit by lanterns, and in the hearts of those who had long laboured under decisions made across an ocean. The British Army was not yet feared, only watched. It was the red line of authority. Present, but distant. In the minds of most, it was still possible to live under its shadow and sleep well. They did not know that even now, the first slow unraveling had begun. Not in a single moment, but in 100 tiny ways. A wrong word, a small law, a tax, a refusal, a silence that spoke too loud. These were not battles, not yet, but they were signs. The kind that only look obvious when it's already too late to turn back. In Parliament, the question of America was a matter of policy. It was not yet a storm, only an inconvenience. The colonies were useful, and that was all. They provided goods, raw and steady, timber, tobacco, fish, fur. They were not meant to be political. They were not meant to speak, but voices were rising, far away, and the cost of empire had grown. The 7 Years' War had left debts like wounds across the British treasury. And so, the colonies would be asked to help pay. It seemed fair to some. After all, had not British soldiers bled for American soil? Had not the empire protected them from the French, the natives, the unknown? But the colonies did not see it that way. They had their own memories, their own losses, and they had grown slowly, steadily, into something more than just subjects. There were now people in these towns who had never set foot on British soil, who had never seen London, who spoke of home and meant the land beneath their feet. A quiet shift, but powerful. And then came the laws, the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act. Small in some ways, but heavy in meaning. Taxes were not new, but these felt different. They were not agreed upon, not chosen. They came from a place that felt far away and cold. And so came resistance, gentle at first. Letters, petitions, debate. People asked to be heard, and were not. A silence came from across the water, dismissive, confident, the kind of silence that turns questions into resentment. This was not yet war, but it was no longer peace. And in the shadows of barns and over the sound of creek water, there were now whispers of unfairness, of change, and perhaps, someday, of revolution. There was no single moment when rebellion began. It came quietly, like water rising in a field. No one knew who felt it first. Maybe a boy in Boston watching soldiers march past his father's shop. Maybe a widow in Virginia reading a law she could not understand, but knew would make her life harder. Maybe a merchant whose ships were searched without cause, or a preacher whose words now echoed with warning. Slowly, steadily, people began to feel that the world was not what it had seemed. That the ties to the mother country, once soft and familiar, were growing tighter, sharper. People began to gather, to speak, not yet with weapons, but with purpose. They lit candles late into the night and passed around thoughts written in ink. What rights do we have? Who has the power to take them? Can a distant king know the needs of a farmer's field? Can a law written in London understand a storm in New Jersey? The questions were simple, the answers were not. In cities, crowds sometimes formed, angry, unsure, afraid. The redcoats were not yet enemies, but they were watched with colder eyes. Even as many colonists still considered themselves proud Englishmen, there was a new tension in the way they said it. Loyalty had begun to wear thin, not with shouts, but with sighs. No one wanted war. No one prayed for violence. But there is a strange silence that comes before all great changes. A quiet that feels like peace, but isn't. In this silence, people began to prepare, not for attack, but for the possibility that the world might shift beneath them. And in that stillness, the storm slowly turned its face toward the land. The cost of empire is never paid only in coins. After the 7 Years' War, Britain had gained more land, more power, more reach. But with it came debts that curled through every part of the government. And across the ocean, there were colonies that now seemed wealthier, bolder, less dependent than before. Parliament turned toward them, not in anger, but in calculation. It made sense to many in London that the colonies should help pay. But the people of the colonies had not asked for this. They had not asked for soldiers in their streets or stamps on their papers. Still, the laws came, each one small, but each one tightening the thread. The Sugar Act, the Currency Act, the Stamp Act. These were not weapons, not yet, but they were felt like pressure in the chest, and they came without invitation. Laws passed by men who would never see the towns they governed, whose shoes would never touch the muddy roads of New Haven or the narrow streets of Boston. The first protests were quiet. A letter, a petition, a vote in a colonial assembly. People believed still that reason would win, that if they explained themselves clearly, the king would listen, that he would understand. But the answers came in silence. Or worse, in more laws. And in the middle of it all stood the merchants, the craftsmen, the printers. Those who could feel the weight of each new act in the coins they could no longer keep. Trade slowed, anger rose, but still, most people kept to their routines. They rose early, worked hard, and waited for fairness. It did not come. In the drawing rooms of London, the colonies were often spoken of like distant fields, useful, unruly, needing discipline. Parliament believed in order, in structure. And they believed the colonies had benefited long enough from British protection without offering enough in return. What they didn't see, or chose not to, was that the colonies had changed. They were no longer clusters of dependent towns. They were growing, reading, debating, printing, thinking. These were not the same people who had first arrived to build cabins in the forest. These were new generations, born in the New World, who looked across the sea with less awe and more suspicion. They still drank tea, still read Shakespeare, still called themselves English. But something had shifted deep inside, like a tree that has begun to lean a different way, though no one yet sees it. When the Stamp Act passed, the resistance became harder to ignore. This law touched nearly everything: newspapers, legal documents, licenses. It was not just a tax. It was a reminder. You are not in charge. You will pay what we say. In towns across the colonies, people began to gather, not as soldiers, but as voices. They called meetings, formed groups, the Sons of Liberty, the Committees of Correspondence, names written in ink that would soon become part of something far larger. But in these early days, they were still men with families and farms, standing in cold halls and asking questions. What is liberty? Who decides the rules? If we are taxed without voice, are we still free? In Britain, many dismissed these men as loud children. But in the colonies, something had begun. It had no anthem, no banner, but it would not be undone. As anger grew, it did not grow evenly. Some remained loyal. They believed rebellion was madness. That order must be kept. That the crown was still the best hope for peace. These people were called loyalists, often quiet, sometimes fearful. They watched the streets fill with protest and felt dread, not pride. They remembered what happened when order fell apart. They feared what came next. But others, more and more, began to see things differently. They saw that laws passed without consent were not just unfair, they were dangerous. And they saw that silence in the face of injustice was no longer a virtue. The words, "no taxation without representation," did not begin as a slogan. They began as a plea, a statement of identity. If we are to be ruled, let it be with our voices heard. Let us not be shadows in someone else's empire. The Stamp Act was repealed, but the wound it opened remained. It had shown the colonies that protest could work, but it also showed Britain that control was slipping. So the Townshend Acts came next. New taxes on glass, paint, tea, small things, perhaps, but they touched daily life, and they came with soldiers. Redcoats were now more visible in the streets, sent not just to defend, but to remind. The message was clear. Authority was not a conversation. It was a fact. In Boston, tensions grew fastest. Crowds gathered. Voices rose. And though no one wanted blood, fear began to creep through the air. People looked at one another differently. Trust wore thin. In the distance, the sound of hooves on roads. In the shadows, men wrote, organizing, preparing, slowly, quietly, but always forward. The colonies were no longer strangers to one another. As tensions deepened, so too did their sense of shared fate. Letters moved between towns, riders carried news faster than before. When Boston resisted, Charleston knew within days. When Philadelphia spoke, New York listened. The idea of one people was still new, but it was growing. Not from speeches alone, but from the lived experience of being unheard together. of suffering the same laws, the same dismissals. In this, unity took root. Not perfect, not clean, but real. And as each act passed, as each soldier arrived, more people began to ask the hardest question of all. What if nothing changed unless we broke away? What would that mean? Could such a thing even be imagined? Independence was not yet a common word, but it had been whispered, in rooms with closed doors, in letters burned after reading. The British response remained stern. Control must be maintained. Dissent must be managed. But the colonies had begun to believe in something else. Not chaos, not war, but a different shape of power. One that came from the people who lived under it. This belief was still fragile, still forming. But belief is a powerful thing. And across the quiet towns, the muddy roads, the coastal ports, belief began to move like light under a door. By the time the decade turned, the cracks could no longer be denied. This was not just unrest, it was transformation. The kind that could not be written away by policy. The kind that would grow no matter who tried to stop it. It happened on a street like any other. Late winter, still cold. The kind of evening when the breath fogs in front of your face and boots leave dark prints in the snow. Boston was restless, and the air held a bitter edge. British troops had been in the city for months. Not just passing through, stationed, visible, present. Their coats were bright against the grey streets. Their drills loud, their presence unwelcome. The city felt smaller now, crowded by authority. Resentment hung like smoke in taverns and doorways. That night, a small crowd gathered. No plan, no weapons, just frustration and the cold. Voices rose, snowballs were thrown, then ice, then words that could not be taken back. A British sentry raised his musket. Others arrived. Still the crowd pressed closer, angry, tired. Then a crack, a flash, a shot. No one knew who fired first, but when it was over, 5 lay dead in the snow. Crispus Attucks was among them. A black man, a sailor, a symbol no one expected. The Boston Massacre, they would call it later. But that night, it was only sorrow, panic, and silence that followed too late. The soldiers were arrested, but the damage was done. It was not just the lives lost. It was the truth revealed. That the British guns could fire on the very people they claimed to protect. That the Empire would not hesitate. That protest could lead to blood. The funerals drew thousands. Bells rang. People stood still. The moment passed. But it was not forgotten. The snow melted, but the memory did not. And across the colonies, word spread. Something had changed. The Boston Massacre was followed by a strange quiet. Parliament pulled back some taxes. The troops were scaled down. A fragile calm returned. But underneath, the fire smouldered. The events in Boston had shaken people. Even those far from the city felt its weight. It was not only the bloodshed. It was the feeling of being watched, contained, dismissed. It was the sense that voices did not matter. Still, some hoped peace might hold. There were merchants who wanted trade restored. Farmers who simply wished for good weather. Mothers who feared what war might take. The colonies were not united in rage. They were united in uncertainty. But as always, power does not wait. And neither did Parliament. They passed the Tea Act, a narrow law, focused, but dangerous in its meaning. It allowed the East India Company to sell tea directly to the colonies, cheaper than ever, but taxed. A clever trap. A tax made sweet. Some might have accepted it, might have bought the tea, ignored the insult, but others saw it clearly. A trick. A rope wrapped in silk. In Boston, resistance took shape. Men disguised themselves as Mohawk warriors, their faces painted in the cold. They moved through the harbour quietly. They boarded the ships. And without harming anyone, without lighting a single fire, they dumped the tea into the dark waters below. over 300 chests. The harbour smelled of it for days. The British saw it as an outrage, a direct attack, an embarrassment. They answered with harshness. The coercive axe, known to the colonies as the intolerable axe. Boston's port was closed. The city's government restricted. Power tightened its grip. The punishment of Boston did not isolate the city. It drew others closer. In towns across the colonies, people began to speak of Boston not as an outlier, but as a symbol. If it could happen there, it could happen anywhere. If Parliament could close a city's harbour, dismiss its voice, and place soldiers on its streets, then what was freedom? Where were the limits of rule? The First Continental Congress met in Philadelphia. Delegates arrived slowly. Men from different colonies, different walks of life. They had never before gathered like this. Some wore fine coats, others, dust from the road. They brought fear, hope, letters from home. They did not speak yet of war, but they spoke of unity, of common cause. They called for rights long denied. They made no demands for independence, only for fairness, recognition, dignity. But even those words echoed loud. In London, they were not received kindly. They were read with narrowed eyes. Rebellion, they called it. Subversion. And with each step forward in the colonies, Britain sent ships, sent men, sent law in iron and cloth. The colonies watched and waited, but the waiting grew thin. And then came General Gage, British commander in Boston. He received orders to seize the colonists' weapons, to quiet the stirrings before they grew louder. It was meant to be simple, a show of force, but the fire that had waited so long was about to light. In April 1775, British troops marched toward Concord. The plan was to capture arms hidden by colonial militias, but the night held other intentions. In Lexington, a group of militiamen stood waiting, cold, uncertain. A line of farmers, blacksmiths, and boys. They had not come to start a war, only to stand, to be seen. The British arrived in silence, tense, well-trained. The two lines faced each other, the morning light barely broken. No one knows who fired first. A single shot, then more. Smoke, chaos. When it ended, 8 colonists lay dead. The British moved on to Concord. But there the story changed. Militiamen had gathered in greater numbers. They fought from behind trees, fences, stones. They knew the land. They moved with it. By the time the British turned back toward Boston, they were under constant fire. The retreat was long and costly. Nearly 300 British soldiers killed or wounded. The news spread like wind. The colonies awakened. Men took up arms. Militias formed. Bells rang. The time for petitions had ended. The war had begun, not by choice, not by plan, but by the weight of every year that had come before. The first flames were real now, and they would not be put out with silence. The air was heavy with uncertainty. Spring had come, but the land was restless, as if it held its breath. Around Boston, militias gathered from every corner. Men who had never dreamed of war now wore muskets and powder horns. They moved in silence, slow and careful, as if the trees themselves whispered warnings. The British, entrenched in their red coats, watched with suspicion and dread. The city was no longer theirs alone. Around them fields and hills hid eyes and arms. The first great battle of this new time was near, though none could yet name it. On a ridge known as Bunker Hill, colonists took position. They were farmers and tradesmen, standing shoulder to shoulder, knowing that the cost of holding ground might be their last breath. The British army moved up the slope in tight lines, disciplined and sure. But the colonists held fast, firing slowly, deliberately. The smoke rose, thick and choking. The ground trembled beneath the pounding of boots. When the hill finally fell, it was with a price that shook both sides. The British had won the ground, but lost thousands of men. The colonists lost fewer, but gained something far greater: belief in their power. The battle was not just blood and fire, it was a quiet turning point. The realization that the fight was real, that the old world was slipping away, and that new voices were rising, no longer afraid to be heard. As the months passed, the struggle spread beyond Massachusetts. Across the colonies, the war was no longer distant news, but an all-consuming reality. Armies were raised, camps formed, and strategies made in hurried meetings under candlelight. Yet, the fight was not only on the fields. It was in the hearts of those who stayed behind. In the quiet towns, life went on, but with a shadow. Children played in streets lined with faded flags. Women tended homes with hands roughened by work and worry. They waited, hoping for safety, but preparing for loss. The world had grown smaller and louder all at once. Communication moved swiftly. News from one colony reached another with urgency, carrying stories of bravery and despair. At the center of it all stood men like George Washington, chosen not just for his strength, but for the calm he carried like a cloak. He understood that this war was more than muskets and cannon. It was about people, about trust, about holding on when the dark pressed close. Washington's presence was a quiet anchor. His decisions were slow, measured, full of doubt and hope intertwined. He knew the weight he carried. It was not just a battle for land, but for the soul of a people who dared to dream differently. In England, the king and his ministers watched with growing concern. The colonies were no longer unruly children. They were enemies. Parliament debated harsh measures and tougher control. But the war was expensive, far from home and growing. The crown sent reinforcements and supplies, but the colonists were ready. Not always with polished lines and trained soldiers, but with resilience born of desperation and belief. Battles erupted in fields, forests, and towns. The war was not the neat confrontation that the generals imagined. It was guerrilla skirmishes, surprise attacks, slow sieges. It was the roar of muskets at dawn, and the silent nights broken by distant gunfire. The land itself became a weapon and a refuge. Those who knew it best used it to survive. The colonists did not just fight a foreign army, they fought the idea of submission. They fought for a voice, a place, a future. Every fight was a story of sacrifice. Men who left behind families to face the unknown, mothers who waited and prayed, children who grew up too fast, their childhood shadowed by loss. The March of Power was not only the advance of armies, but the rise of a new identity. As summer faded to fall, the struggle stretched south and west. The war was no longer a single place, but a moving tide. Towns burned, farms were abandoned, loyalties were tested, families divided. The old order was cracking, not with thunder, but with the slow, persistent drip of broken promises and shifting alliances. In this landscape, the colonists made a bold move. They gathered in Philadelphia to form a new Continental Congress. The delegates spoke in careful tones, but with growing confidence. They knew that words could now carry the weight of action. They drafted plans, sent requests for aid, and most importantly, they sent a message. The colonies would stand together. Not as separate towns or states, but as one people. This was a dangerous idea. Treason in the eyes of the crown. But in the eyes of those who gathered, it was hope. The hope that freedom was possible, that government could be by the people, for the people. The March of Power was no longer just about muskets on the hill, but the birth of a nation's dream. It was fragile, it was uncertain, but it was unstoppable. The war was no longer confined to the narrow roads of New England. It spread like smoke carried by the wind, touching the far reaches of the continent and beyond. To the north, the cold forests of Canada held battles few knew well, but that shaped the fate of the colonies. The failed invasion of Quebec was a bitter lesson. Men who had crossed frozen rivers and deep snows found themselves facing harsh winters and fierce defenders. The dream of bringing Canada into the new union faltered. swallowed by ice and gunfire. The cost was high: frozen limbs, shattered hopes, and silent graves beneath unfamiliar trees. Yet, even in defeat, a seed was planted. The war was no longer a local quarrel, but a continent-wide struggle. And across the ocean, the echoes of battle stirred foreign powers. France, nursing old wounds from past losses, saw opportunity in the colonies' fight. The Bourbon court moved quietly but decisively, sending aid, weapons, and later armies. The American Revolution became part of a larger world's game, where alliances shifted and empires watched from afar. The war was growing, not just in size, but in meaning. In the midst of this fire, the colonies grappled with the idea of themselves. They were no longer just Englishmen far from home. They were something new, something unformed but full of promise. The Continental Congress met in heated rooms filled with smoke and hope. They wrestled with questions that would shape not just a war, but a nation. How to govern a land so vast? How to unite such different peoples? How to speak with one voice? From these struggles came the earliest drafts of what would become a new government. Ideas flowed: liberty, equality, representation. But they were shadows then, not yet fully shaped. And amidst these debates, words took flight that would change the world. The Declaration of Independence was born not just from politics, but from deep feeling. It spoke of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, of rights that were not given but inherent. It was a bold claim, a promise, and a warning. To declare independence was to say the old bonds were broken, that a new path had begun. The words were heavy with hope and danger. They rang out like a bell across the colonies and across the world. Some heard freedom, others heard rebellion. The Declaration did not end the war, it sharpened it. It made enemies clearer and alliances stronger. Soldiers fought with renewed purpose. Each battle was no longer just for land or law, but for the very idea of a nation. The war at home deepened. Families found themselves torn apart by loyalties. Brothers fought brothers. Friends became foes. The quiet farms became fields of loss and pain. Women stepped into new roles. They managed homes and farms. They tended wounded soldiers. They carried news and comfort. Their voices were often silent in the histories, but their presence was felt in every corner of the struggle. Enslaved people watched the promises of liberty with wary eyes. Some sought freedom by joining one side or the other. Others hoped for change that still seemed distant. Native nations found themselves caught in the middle, their lands the prize for both armies. The world was not simply black and white. It was a tangle of hopes, fears, betrayals, and survival. The fire of war burned fiercely, but it also illuminated the complexities of a new world being born. As the war stretched on, the fighting moved to the sea and the distant frontiers. Privateers hunted British ships, turning the oceans into battlefields. Ports were blockaded, supply lines stretched thin. The struggle was no longer just in fields and towns, but on waves and in forests. The colonial cause gained strength with the arrival of French fleets and troops, turning the tide at moments critical and fragile. Battles like Saratoga became symbols of change, proof that victory was possible. But with every success came cost. Food ran low, disease spread, morale faltered. The war was a test not just of arms, but of endurance. In camps and on battlefields, men wrote letters home filled with longing and fear. They remembered their families and dreamed of peace. The world was on fire, but within that flame, the hope of a new nation glowed quietly, waiting to be born. The war stretched beyond the battlefield. It reached into the quiet corners of homes and hearts, touching those who did not march with muskets but lived in its shadow. Families were divided not only by distance but by loyalty. Some stood firm with the crown, known as loyalists, believing that the empire's strength would bring order and peace. Others chose the uncertain path of rebellion, driven by a longing for freedom and voice. Brothers faced brothers, Fathers faced sons, and neighbors turned wary eyes toward one another. The lines drawn were not always clear, but the cost was real. Homes were abandoned. Fields lay fallow. The war was no longer distant thunder, but a storm raging within communities. Women bore burdens unseen by most. With husbands, fathers, and sons away, they kept farms running, managed households, and cared for the wounded. They carried the weight of uncertainty, the constant ache of absence. Some disguised themselves as men to fight alongside the armies. Others smuggled supplies or carried messages through dangerous territory. Their courage was quiet, often unspoken, but essential. They kept the flame of hope alive in the coldest nights. Letters from the front spoke of their strength, their resilience. They were the backbone of the struggle, weaving survival into everyday life, while the world burned around them. Enslaved people watched the war with guarded eyes. The promise of liberty was a distant echo in fields shadowed by chains. Some seized the chaos as a chance to seek freedom, joining the British who offered it to those who would fight against the rebels. Others sided with the colonists, hoping that the ideals of the revolution would one day include them. The contradiction was sharp and painful, a war for freedom that did not yet mean freedom for all. Native nations found themselves caught between worlds. Their lands, once vast and free, were battlefields for empires and colonies. They fought, fled, and negotiated, trying to protect what remained of their homes and ways of life. The war was not theirs, but it demanded everything. Amid the violence and loss, the war at home was a test of spirit. Communities held fast to rituals, to faith, to memory. Churches filled with whispered prayers. Families gathered for brief moments of peace. Songs carried stories of hope and sorrow. The cost of the revolution was counted not just in battles won or lost, but in the quiet moments of endurance. Every harvest missed, every letter unanswered, every child left waiting. These were the hidden casualties. And yet, within this pain, there was also a fierce determination. The war was not just about territory. It was about a vision of life that would survive beyond the smoke and blood. It was about a future shaped by those who dared to dream it. There are stretches of time when no guns fire, no drums beat, no feet march in unison. The world simply waits. Smoke clears, blood dries, and for a moment, silence returns. Not peace, only quiet. In these hours between battles, soldiers lie in cold fields, staring up at foreign skies. They think of home. They think of family. They wonder how long this will last and who will not return. The war does not end when the fighting stops. It changes shape. It hides in thoughts, in the ache of worn boots, in the hunger that lingers after the last hard biscuit is gone. At Valley Forge, the cold came like an enemy, not with swords, but with wind sharp as iron. Men huddled in tents made of cloth and wood. They wrapped their feet in rags. They shared what little they had. There were no victories there, only survival. Each day was a quiet struggle. The snow covered the hills like a shroud, yet they stayed, not because they were forced, but because they believed in something they could not yet name. The silence between battles was filled with labor. Not only the digging of trenches or the mending of uniforms, but the constant work of keeping hope alive. Letters moved slowly across the colonies. Ink faded with tears and rain. A mother wrote to her son, not knowing if he still lived. A wife lit a candle each night, whispering her husband's name into the dark. Communities gathered to pray, to cook together, to rebuild what had been lost. These moments of stillness were not free from pain. They held a different kind of weight. The waiting. The not knowing. The sound of wind through an empty barn. The quiet of a church with more names on its prayer list than faces in its pews. The revolution was not always loud. Sometimes it was just the sound of a child asking why his father had not come home. General Washington walked among his men often without speaking. He felt the silence too, not as weakness, but as burden. Leadership in these days was not about strategy alone. It was about steadiness, about standing still when everything felt like it might fall. He watched his army freeze, hunger, doubt, but they did not leave. Even when the British held cities like New York and Philadelphia, the heart of the revolution kept beating out here, in snowbanks, in small fires, in whispered songs. Training began slowly. Order returned, and from the quiet, a new kind of strength was born, not forged by weapons, but by endurance. The army that limped into Valley Forge was not the same one that would emerge. Something had hardened. Something had grown. Still, no one could say when victory would come, or if it would come at all. But they waited together, and that too was a form of resistance. While armies paused, diplomacy moved forward. Envoys crossed oceans in ships that creaked with every wave. They carried messages in careful hands, not knowing how they would be received. In France, American diplomats worked by candlelight, writing letters filled with urgency and hope. Benjamin Franklin, with his quiet wit and deep patience, became a symbol of reason. He understood the power of silence, of listening. He wore plain clothes in ornate rooms, and won trust through calm rather than force. France, watching the war from afar, weighed its choices carefully. To aid the colonies was to risk much, but to ignore them was to watch a rival grow stronger. And so, slowly, France stepped closer. The alliance was not born of love, but of shared purpose. Still, when it came, it brought more than soldiers. It brought belief that this cause, distant, fragile, might endure. And in the quiet before new battles, that belief gave the colonists something to hold on to. In every valley, in every home, the silence held a question. How long can we last? And the answer, soft but certain, was always as long as we must. The world turned slowly, and with it so did the war. What began in distant fields and hurried letters had now become something vast. The seasons changed, and the people changed with them. Battles were no longer isolated events. They were signs, steps in a story none could stop. At Saratoga, something shifted. Not just because the British surrendered, though they did, but because the world saw it. France saw it. Spain watched from afar. It was no longer just a rebellion on the edge of empire. It was a conflict that could reshape continents. The British had planned to split the colonies, to cut them in two. But they misjudged the land, the roads, the cold, the people. General Burgoyne marched south with confidence, but confidence does not carry food, nor build bridges. The forest slowed him. The rivers stopped him. The locals resisted. In time, the army that marched so proudly was forced to surrender. The world took notice, and in the silence that followed, new alliances stirred. What had once seemed impossible now felt inevitable. The colonists were no longer alone. The French stepped forward, cautious but committed. Not just in secret, not just with gold and supplies, but openly. Ships crossed the ocean. Soldiers trained. Generals studied new maps. France had not forgotten its own losses to Britain in earlier wars. This was a chance to reclaim pride, to shape the world once more. The colonies welcomed the aid with gratitude and quiet caution. Allies brought hope, but also new expectations. Now, the revolution was not just about one people, it was part of a global puzzle. The British, alarmed, adjusted their plans. The war expanded. New fronts opened. Southern cities began to burn. Armies shifted like storm clouds, unpredictable and full of threat. And behind it all, the people endured. Towns changed hands more than once. Flags rose and fell above the same rooftops. The civilians were caught in between. Not soldiers, not rulers, but the ones who suffered most. In the Carolinas, the war grew personal. It was not only uniforms and ranks, it was neighbors, former friends. The fighting became sharp and close, often with no warning. There were ambushes in woods, skirmishes on dusty roads, the lines blurred. Who was patriot? Who was loyalist? It depended on the day, the valley, the sound of marching feet. Stories tell of homes burned by former comrades, of men dragged from porches into the night, of vengeance passed from family to family. The war in the South was not noble. It was desperate. It was survival. General Cornwallis moved with confidence through Georgia and the Carolinas, capturing ground but losing hearts. For every victory, another fire sparked. Militias formed from farmers and hunters. They fought with what they had: rifles, knives, memory. In the silence between their battles, they buried the dead and whispered promises to the living, that they would not be ruled again. But not all promises were kept. The revolution, born in ideals, struggled to hold itself to them. Freedom was spoken loudly, yet not all were free. Enslaved people saw armies pass, flags rise, speeches made, and wondered where they stood. Some ran to British lines, promised liberty in exchange for service. Others followed the rebels, hoping their sacrifice would bring change. Too often, they were returned to chains when battles ended. The revolution's words were wide, but their reach was narrow. Native nations faced the same betrayal. Some allied with the British, hoping to protect their land. Others stayed neutral, waiting. But when the war moved west, it moved through their forests, their rivers. Treaties were broken, villages destroyed, trust was lost. These were the broken promises, the ones that would echo long after the gunpowder cleared. The dream of liberty was powerful, but it was not clean. It carried shadows, and those shadows grew with every mile marched. As 1780 passed into 1781, the war reached its most uncertain point. Both sides were tired. The British had taken cities, but not the will of the people. The Americans had gained allies, but not yet peace. Supply lines grew thin. Soldiers went unpaid. Some mutinied. Washington wrote letters heavy with worry. The war could still be lost. And yet, through all this, the people did not give up. Not entirely. They planted when they could. They prayed when words failed. They sang songs to remember what they had already endured. The turning points were not always on maps. They were in the minds of those who kept believing. Those who had lost everything but still rose each morning, who watched the sky and listened for news. In those quiet places, the revolution lived on, not just in battles, but in memory, in patience, in the refusal to be silent again. The tide did not turn all at once. There was no sudden gust of victory, no grand trumpet that signaled the end. It changed slowly, like light creeping over a frozen field. In 1781, the war still lived in every corner. The British held parts of the South. The North was weary, stretched thin. The revolution had lasted too long for easy hope, and too far for quick retreat. But there were signs, small, quiet signs, that the end had begun to unfold. General Nathaniel Greene, once overshadowed by others, now carried the weight of the Southern campaign. He did not seek decisive victory. He sought attrition, to exhaust, to draw the enemy far from their supplies, far from their comforts. His strategy was not to win, but to wear down, to make the British chase shadows across Carolina's long roads and broken fields. Each skirmish was not a battle to be remembered, but a stitch in a larger fabric. It was patient work, bleeding time, drawing out the fire until it dimmed. In Virginia, the British turned toward Yorktown. General Cornwallis moved there with confidence, seeking shelter by the sea, trusting in the strength of British naval power. But the sea, too, was shifting. French ships sailed north, strong and prepared. The alliance had grown real, not just words on parchment, but soldiers in boots. Captains at sea and artillery moved piece by piece across a rough ground. Washington saw the moment. He saw the chance not just to strike, but to end. With quiet urgency, He moved his army south, joining French forces under Rochambeau. The march was long, the road uncertain, but the goal clear: to trap Cornwallis before rescue could arrive. The siege began in the fading warmth of autumn. Dirt flew as trenches deepened. Cannon were rolled into place. Night fires flickered in the distance. For days, the thunder of bombardment shook the air. British soldiers crouched, behind walls that crumbled around them. Civilians took shelter. The sound never stopped. It was not chaos. It was method. Relentless. Precise. The end was coming, and it came in silence as much as sound. On October 19, 1781, General Cornwallis surrendered. Not in person, but through an officer. His pride would not let him face the final moment. The British troops marched out slowly, stacking their weapons. Their band played a tune known as "The World Turned Upside Down." And for many, it had. An empire that stretched across oceans had been stopped by farmers, craftsmen, and dreamers. The war was not yet officially over, not on paper, not in treaty, but the heart of it had been cut. There would be no grand return, no reassertion of rule. Britain would fight a while longer, but its grip had slipped. Word of Yorktown moved slowly through the colonies. When it arrived, it came like warm rain. People cried in the streets. Bells rang again. After years of waiting, the hope that had burned low now glowed steady. But the joy was quiet too. It carried memory of those not there to see it, of homes lost, of arms emptied. The revolution had been won, but it had taken everything. Even in victory, uncertainty remained. The colonies had fought together, but they had not yet learned how to live together. 13 governments, 13 identities, and now one fragile future. The war had united them, but peace would test them. Questions rose like smoke from burned ground. Who would lead? What would this country look like? Could it hold? The Articles of Confederation offered structure, but it was weak, uncertain. There were debts to pay, armies to disband, and always the voices of those who had been promised things now waiting to see them delivered. Veterans wanted land, pay, recognition. Families wanted the return of sons and husbands. Freed black men who had served wanted the freedom they were told would come. Native nations wanted peace, but found only more settlers. Slavery, that deep wound, remained. The nation was born, but it carried contradictions from its first breath. Still, people tried. They gathered again. They listened. They hoped. Some planted again in fields untouched by cannon. Some rebuilt homes, brick by brick. Some simply sat in silence, remembering. In Paris, diplomats from both sides met. Cold rooms, long debates. Britain came not in defeat, but in calculation. What could be preserved? What must be let go? The American delegation, Franklin, Adams, Jay, pushed not just for peace, but for independence in full. Borders were drawn, language was polished, a treaty was shaped. It took time, and when it was done, the war was over in word as well as deed. The Treaty of Paris, signed in 1783, recognized the United States of America, a name that still felt strange in the mouth. A dream made visible. The world watched, some with admiration, some with fear. A republic, born from rebellion. What would it become? And would it survive its own creation? These questions hung in the air long after the ink dried. The British ships sailed away. The soldiers left their forts, and the new nation stood on soil that was now, by law, its own. But freedom, once declared, does not guarantee peace. What followed was not celebration alone. It was reckoning, with loss, with difference, with power. There was joy, yes, but joy held by hands worn from war. Cities began to grow again. Trade resumed, but always the memory lingered. The war had changed everything. Some had gained land, others graves. Some had risen in new ranks, Others had been forgotten. The land bore marks that would never fully fade. The tide had turned. The war had ended. But the story was far from over. For now, there was breath. There was space. There was time to begin again. Victory brought no sudden peace. It arrived with tired feet and weary hearts. The banners were lowered. The guns fell silent. But inside, the war had not ended for everyone. The battles that followed were softer, but more enduring. Private battles of grief, debt, confusion, and memory. Across the new nation, men returned to the homes they had left. But nothing was quite the same. Children were older, fields were overgrown, empty chairs waited at tables that would never be full again. The survivors brought stories, but also silence. Many spoke little of what they had seen. The war lived inside them now, tucked away behind their eyes. The cheers of victory could not erase what they had endured. Not all wounds bled. Some sat quietly in the soul, shaping a person without words. In the cities, merchants reopened shops, but the economy was fragile. The country had no central currency, and inflation left once valued money almost worthless. Veterans who had fought for years returned to find their pay delayed or denied. Promises had been made on paper and in speeches, land grants, pensions, recognition, but now those promises were pushed aside in the name of political caution. Many sold their war bonds for a fraction of their worth, just to feed their families. Others packed their belongings and moved west, chasing new land, new beginnings, and a chance to leave the past behind. But even there, the war followed. The frontier was not empty. Native peoples lived there, and they watched the approach of settlers with fear and fury. They had seen treaties broken before. Now they watched as new ones were written, again without their voices. The Articles of Confederation, meant to guide the new nation, proved too weak. Congress could make decisions but could not enforce them. Each state held tight to its power. Unity had been enough to fight a war, but not enough to build a future. Border disputes flared. Trade between states stalled. Foreign nations, once allies, now questioned the strength of this young republic. Britain still held posts along the frontier. Spain controlled the Mississippi and waited to see if the new nation would fracture. The victories of the Revolution were fading beneath the weight of everyday struggles. Farmers in Massachusetts, drowning in debt, rose in open protest. They had fought for liberty, but now faced jail for unpaid taxes. Shays' Rebellion, as it came to be known, shook the nation's leaders. If those who fought for freedom could no longer feed their families, what had truly changed? In private homes, people mourned not just the dead, but the distance. Friends lost to time. Ideals lost to compromise. The revolution had lit a fire, but fires can consume as well as warm. Women who had managed homes and farms during the war now found themselves expected to step back into silence. Their voices had carried the weight of a nation. Now they were asked to return to stillness. Black soldiers who had worn the uniform of freedom were returned to slavery by the very men who had written of liberty. Native communities that had tried to remain neutral were punished as enemies. The dream of equality had faded into the dust of politics and property. Still, people continued. They worked, they hoped, they loved, but they carried disappointment like another kind of uniform. Worn, heavy, not easily set aside. The revolution had won a country, but in its quiet corners, 1,000 small defeats whispered through the lives of its people. Even as the treaty was signed and flags exchanged, not everyone laid down their arms. Along the fringes of the new country, final offensives crept across forests and rivers like the last echoes of thunder after a storm. The British still occupied posts along the frontier, their retreat measured and deliberate. In the south and west, skirmishes flared where order had not yet taken hold. Loyalists who had once served the crown now faced retribution or exile. Some fled north to Canada. Others moved quietly, selling their land and disappearing into the wilderness. Their world had ended, not with a bang, but with a slow erasure. The revolution had not just defeated an empire, it had unmade a way of life. In these final movements, the war became something quieter. It became displacement, isolation, 1,000 small farewells with no witnesses. British ships lingered offshore, slow to leave, as if unsure whether to vanish or remain a shadow on the horizon. In this strange in-between time, the Continental Army waited, still encamped, still unpaid, still held together by the fragile threads of loyalty and faith. Many had not seen their families in years. Their uniforms were threadbare, their shoes worn thin. Washington visited them often, his presence a steadying force. He spoke little, but when he did, it was with the weight of all he had carried. He had not fought for glory. He had endured. And now, with the war ending, he prepared to leave power, to return to his farm in Mount Vernon. This was a decision that surprised the world. In history, men who held power so long rarely gave it back. But Washington stepped down. Quietly, deliberately, with the same restraint he had shown in war. His farewell to his officers at Fraunces Tavern in New York was not grand. It was quiet. He embraced them, one by one, and then he left. The weight of command lifted. The memory of war folded into his silence. In that gesture, a republic was made real, not through speeches, but through self-denial. But peace did not erase pain. The soldiers returned home to find fields gone to seed, debts waiting, promises broken. Many would never receive what they had earned. Pensions vanished in legal disputes. Land grants disappeared into speculation and delay. Some sold their medals to feed their children. The country they had fought for now asked them to be patient, to trust in a government still learning how to stand. Many did. Some did not. The scars of war stayed long after the uniforms were put away. Widows raised children with stories instead of fathers. Towns rebuilt, but the absences could not be patched with wood or stone. The fight for independence had ended, but the fight for justice, for dignity, for stability, that had only begun. The final offensives of war were not fought with muskets, but with memory. They were fought in courtrooms, in letters, in long walks through fields that had once been stained with fire. Elsewhere, the shape of the world had shifted. The French Revolution loomed just beyond the decade. Ideas that had sparked in Philadelphia and Boston now drifted across oceans. But revolutions do not always travel cleanly. What had worked in America did not fit so easily in other lands. The American experiment, still unfinished, was watched with hope and fear. The British Empire nursed its wounds. Spain recalculated its maps. Across Europe, kings and ministers debated not just policy, but survival. And in America, the people asked new questions. Now that they were free, who were they? What did freedom mean in a land where some were still enslaved? Where the land still belonged to others who had never surrendered it? Where wealth shaped votes, and women had no voice in the laws they followed? These were not questions the war had answered. These were the questions it had left behind. Final offensives sometimes come not from enemy fire, but from within. From the slow unraveling of myth. From the quiet doubt that follows belief. From the recognition that to build something lasting, one must first admit what remains unfinished. The fragile threads that held the new nation began to fray. The Articles of Confederation, a document born of compromise and necessity, proved weak against the storms of governance. States acted as separate kingdoms, guarding their own interests with suspicion. Trade disputes flared like small fires, choking the breath from a young economy still trying to find its footing. The absence of a strong central power left gaps filled by unrest and uncertainty. Farmers faced crushing debts. Merchants faced tariffs that varied from one state to another. The promise of union felt distant, almost fragile. And beneath it all lay the memory of war. A war that had bound people together, but had not yet taught them how to live together. The country seemed to teeter on the edge of collapse, caught between dreams and reality. Shays' rebellion was a symptom of this fracture. In Massachusetts, desperate farmers, many veterans of the Revolution, faced courts that demanded payment they could not afford. Taxes were raised, lands were seized. The government's response was harsh, fueling anger and fear. Men took up arms again, not against a foreign enemy, but against their own leaders. The rebellion was a quiet scream, a call for justice that echoed across the states. It revealed a deeper truth. The new nation was not yet strong enough to protect all its people. The rebellion ended, but its lessons did not fade. Leaders knew that something had to change, or the fragile union might unravel completely. In the halls of power, debates grew fierce. Voices clashed over the nature of government. Should it be strong or limited? Should power lie in the hands of the many or the few? The Constitutional Convention gathered men from across the states, some wary, others hopeful. They spoke of balance, compromise, and the need to create a government that could endure. The Constitution was born in tension, between freedom and control, between state and nation, between past and future. It was imperfect, but it was a beginning. The new document promised a stronger union, one capable of meeting challenges no single state could face alone. Yet, its words left many unsettled. For it did not solve all problems. It left slavery untouched. It left women silent. It created a government, but not a perfect one. The consequences of those choices would echo for generations. Meanwhile, ordinary people lived in the shadows of these great debates. They returned to fields scarred by war. They rebuilt homes broken by conflict. They carried memories of loss, but also of hope. Towns grew slowly. Trade began to pick up again. Yet beneath the surface, tension simmered. Native nations, pushed westward, resisted the tide of settlers. Treaties were signed and broken. Violence flared in the frontier. The land that had once been wild was now a battleground of cultures and claims. The promise of freedom for some was a threat to others. The consequences of revolution stretched beyond battlefields, into forests and rivers, into the lives of those who had not chosen sides, but were forced to live with its outcomes. The young republic faced foreign threats as well. Britain refused to leave forts in the Northwest Territory. Spain controlled the Mississippi River, limiting trade. France, burdened by its own revolutions, offered little support. The new nation was surrounded by uncertainty. The collapse of old orders did not guarantee the rise of new ones. The consequence of revolution was a long, slow process of building. Laws, alliances, identity. It was a fragile dance between chaos and order. The revolution had broken chains, but the struggle to define what freedom truly meant was only beginning. The echoes of that collapse reverberated in every corner, shaping a nation that was still learning to stand on its own. Memory is a fragile thing. It bends and shifts with time, shaped by those who tell the story and those who listen. The American Revolution, a storm of fire and blood, did not vanish when the last cannon was silenced. It lived on in the hearts of those who had fought and those who had lost. But memory is not a single voice. It is many. Some loud, some quiet. Some buried deep beneath the earth or hidden in the cracks of old buildings. Families kept the stories alive around worn tables and flickering hearths, passing down tales of bravery and sacrifice, of harsh winters and fierce battles. Yet, not all memories were equal. Some were honored with monuments and poems. Others were forgotten, left to fade like the shadows cast by twilight. The men who signed the Declaration of Independence became heroes in the eyes of many. Their names etched into history, their faces carved in marble. They were remembered as fathers of a nation, champions of liberty. But the story was more complicated. These leaders were not flawless. They carried contradictions within themselves. Many owned slaves. Many balanced ideals with pragmatism, often leaving the most vulnerable behind. The price of memory was to hold both pride and pain, to celebrate freedom while acknowledging its limits, to tell a story of unity while remembering the divisions that never fully healed. The revolution was a beginning, but not an end. For those who had fought on the losing side, the loyalists, memory was harsher. Many fled, their homes burned or confiscated. Their stories became whispers, told in quiet corners or in distant lands. Canada became a refuge, a place where the defeated could rebuild. But even there, the memory of loyalty was bittersweet. To remember was to carry loss and exile. Some returned to America decades later, hoping to reclaim what was lost. Others made new lives, their memories folded into the complex tapestry of a changing continent. The revolution's shadows stretched wide, touching every coast and crossing every ocean. The women of the revolution held stories often left out of textbooks. They kept homes and families together. They carried messages through enemy lines. They sewed uniforms and tended the wounded. Their sacrifices were quiet but profound. Yet history often rendered them invisible. It took generations for their voices to be heard in the chorus of remembrance. Their memories remind us that war is not only fought with muskets, but with endurance, care, and courage that does not always wear a uniform. Remembering them reshapes the story, making it fuller and more true. The revolution also left scars on those who had been enslaved. Freedom's promise was a distant light for many. Some took up arms, hoping to earn their liberty. Some escaped to British lines where freedom was offered as a weapon against the rebels. But the end of the war did not end slavery. Many were returned to bondage. Their stories, too, are part of the price of memory. To remember the revolution honestly is to confront these truths, to hold the hopes alongside the betrayals, to listen to voices that have long been silenced. Native nations, whose lands and lives were forever changed, also bear the cost. Their memory is one of loss and resistance. Their stories challenge the simple narratives of victory and freedom. Monuments and holidays mark the revolution's memory in public spaces. Fireworks on July 4th burst like echoes of past battles. Schools teach stories of bravery and nationhood. But memory is not fixed. It is alive, growing and changing with each generation. It asks questions about who is included and who is left out. It reminds us that history is not just the past, but a conversation between then and now. The price of memory is responsibility. To remember fully, honestly, and with empathy. To carry the wounds and the dreams together. The revolution's legacy lives not only in history books, but in the very shape of the nation. Its ideals inspire ongoing struggles for justice, equality, and freedom. The price paid by those who fought echoes in every protest and every act of courage. Remembering the revolution means honoring that ongoing fight. It means holding space for all stories, even those that challenge comfort. It means understanding that the past is not a distant place, but a presence that shapes the future. The price of memory is never small. It is the cost of truth, of hope, and of the quiet, steady work of building a nation from both its light and its shadow. The fire of revolution eventually burns low, leaving behind ashes, embers, and the faint glow of what once was. What remains after the fire is not only the land, the laws, or the flags, but the deeper marks left on people's lives and hearts. The American Revolution shaped a nation, yes, but it also shaped the souls of those who lived through it, and the generations that followed. The smoke cleared, revealing a country both new and unfinished, full of promise, yet heavy with contradictions. The dream of freedom had been kindled, but it flickered in the winds of change. It was a beginning that asked for care, patience, and endless work. The young republic faced the vastness of its own creation. The 13 colonies were no longer separate entities, but parts of something larger, fragile, and unsteady. Building a nation from revolution's ashes required more than laws. It required understanding. The people who fought side by side found themselves divided by geography, by race, by class, and by vision. The new government struggled to hold these threads together. Each state guarded its power jealously. Slavery, still deeply entrenched, threatened the unity they sought. Native nations, pushed ever farther from their ancestral lands, remained in conflict. What remained after the fire was a landscape of both hope and pain. In the towns and fields, life slowly resumed its rhythms. Families planted crops, rebuilt homes, and raised children in a world forever changed. The war had taken fathers, husbands, brothers. It had left wounds, seen and unseen. The survivors carried memories like scars, quiet reminders of loss and survival. The country's map grew with new settlements, stretching westward into unknown lands. Each new town was a seed, planted in soil rich with history. The fire had cleared some paths, but also left others blocked. The journey ahead was long. The people moved forward with cautious steps, guided by ideals that were still being defined. The legacy of the revolution was not a single story, but many intertwined threads. It was the story of those who fought on battlefields, and those who fought in kitchens, fields, and homes. It was the story of liberty declared, but not yet fully realized. The story of promise and betrayal, of courage and compromise. It was a story that would be told and retold, shaped by each generation's needs and hopes. Statues would rise, flags would wave, but the true legacy lived in the conversations between the past and the present. It lived in the questions people asked about freedom, justice, and belonging. What remained after the fire was also a quiet call to action. The revolution was not an event frozen in time. It was a spark that ignited ongoing struggles for equality and rights. The ideals of liberty inspired abolitionists, suffragists, civil rights activists, and many others who sought to make the nation's promises real for all its people. The fire of revolution reminded them that freedom must be tended like a garden, with care, with patience, with courage to face the weeds and storms. The country's story was still being written, shaped by those who remembered and those who dreamed. The landscape itself held memories. Battlefields became places of reflection. Old homes stood as witnesses to history. Letters and diaries, tucked away for years, were rediscovered, giving voice to the silence and forgotten. Museums opened doors to the past, inviting people to step inside and listen. The fire's ashes were not cold, but warm, alive with stories waiting to be heard. The nation learned that remembering was not about glory alone, but about truth, about holding space for all who lived, fought, and dreamed. The revolution's end was also a beginning, a chance to imagine a different future. It was a reminder that the work of freedom never truly ends. Each generation must carry the flame forward, tending it through dark times and bright. The fire that once raged had changed the world, but what remained was what truly mattered. The hope that from destruction, new life could grow. The American Revolution left behind a land shaped by struggle and sacrifice, but also by resilience and renewal. Its echoes continue in every voice that speaks for justice, in every hand that builds community, and in every heart that dares to dream of freedom.